Hey there, let's dive into the wild world of tycoons and dynasties, the steel barons, oil kings, candy magnates, and retail emperors who rewired not only economies, but the very idea of success. You stand at the threshold of their stories, watching ambition sharpened like steel rails, fortunes rising with the crackle of oil flames, and families tied together or torn apart by money. Their lives are messy, dazzling, and sometimes terrifying, like staring into the engine room of a runaway train. Here's the reality check. You might not outsmart these tycoons, or even approve of their ruthless methods, but you can't deny the gravitational pull of their power. They shaped cities, toppled rivals, and left behind questions we are still asking today. What does it mean to win, and what's the cost of victory? Before you get hooked, hit like and subscribe if you're ready for more epic tales of power and wealth. And don't just watch, drop your favourite tycoon or dynasty in the comments. Maybe it's Rockefeller with his oil grip, Carnegie with his steel symphony, or the Walton family stacking fortunes from aisles of discount goods. Now buckle up and let's jump into this saga of ambition and empires. You begin with Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish immigrant who turned his rags into a fortress of steel. Picture him, a boy working 12-hour shifts in a Pittsburgh cotton factory, his hands small enough to change bobbins on whirring machines. The odds, almost impossible. Yet you see how hunger, not for bread but for opportunity, burns inside him. Poverty wasn't his identity, it was his springboard. Carnegie's ascent was no fairy tale. You witness him climbing rung by rung through telegraph offices, mastering Morse code so quickly that he could recognize messages by sound alone. That quirky skill turned him into a trusted assistant for the railroad magnates, who saw in him not just a worker, but a sharp, tireless learner. Imagine impressing your boss today by knowing every ringtone in the office. Carnegie did the 19th century version. He wasn't merely lucky, he was strategic. You uncover his investments in railroads and oil derricks, small stakes that compounded into serious wealth. But the real turning point comes when he locks onto steel, the lifebloods of a growing America. Bridges, skyscrapers, railroads, steel was destiny, and Carnegie positioned himself as its prophet. Some argue whether his genius was foresight or opportunism, but either way, he built a juggernaut that towered over competitors. Here's a well-known fact. Carnegie Steel produced more steel than all of Great Britain at one point. That's not just business, that's rewriting global balance. His mills were roaring furnaces where innovation danced with brutality. Workers laboured in punishing conditions, sparks flying like angry fireflies, while Carnegie reaped profits that ballooned into one of the greatest fortunes of the Gilded Age. But here's the lesser-known tidbit. Carnegie was fascinated by peace conferences and even dreamed of a world parliament to prevent war. This man who crushed rivals with industrial might also scribbled utopian fantasies about global harmony. It's almost like discovering your favourite action movie star secretly knits sweaters on weekends. Of course, contradictions were Carnegie's constant companions. You feel the tension between his ruthless side and his philanthropic side. On one hand, he cut wages and broke strikes, famously during the Homestead Strike of 1892, where violence scarred his empire. On the other, he preached that the man who dies rich dies disgraced, and pledged to give away most of his fortune. Some argue whether his charity was genuine redemption or just reputation polishing, but either way, he left libraries, universities, and cultural institutions that endure. You walk with him through smoky Pittsburgh nights, where steel beams glow like molten rivers, and boardrooms where fortunes move faster than trains. Carnegie wasn't merely building wealth, he was constructing an identity, half titan, half benefactor. And here's a clever aside. If you've ever felt guilty about buying one extra gadget on Amazon, imagine what it feels like to own half the steel of America while telling yourself you're really in it for humanity. What you witness in Carnegie is the paradox that defines tycoons, ambition that feeds on both greed and idealism. He was a boy dreaming in the flicker of gas lamps, a man wrestling with conscience in palatial mansions, and finally, a legacy that dares you to ask, can one life really balance iron will with a dream for peace? The saga is just beginning, and already you see the blueprint of empire, fire, fortune, and contradictions welded together. You step deeper into Carnegie's story and find something unexpected. For all his obsession with steel and money, his true love was never wealth itself. It was knowledge. While his mills thundered with molten metal, his mind drifted toward the quieter revolution of books. He didn't just want to pile up dollars, he wanted to seed libraries, scatter them like lanterns across America, so that no curious child would have to stand in the dark the way he once did. Picture young Carnegie again, a teenager in Pittsburgh with no spare change for books. Instead, he begged a local benefactor to grant him access to a private collection. That library became his refuge, the place where he devoured Shakespeare, history, philosophy, and science. You uncover that the spark of philanthropy wasn't born in his golden years, but right there in those cramped reading rooms where a boy discovered the universe in ink and paper. Here's the well-known fact. Carnegie funded more than 2,500 libraries worldwide. That's an entire empire of knowledge, brick-and-mortar temples to learning, many of which still stand today. Walk through one of them and you can almost feel his ghost nudging you toward a shelf, whispering, "This is the real treasure." But the quirky tidbit. Carnegie insisted that communities contribute something too. If a town wanted a library, they had to provide the land and promise to maintain it. It wasn't just charity. It was a partnership. Imagine asking for a free car today and being told, "Sure, but you'll need to build the garage, gas it up and keep it running." That was Carnegie's model, give but make others invest as well. This philosophy wasn't random. You recognize it as an extension of his famed Gospel of Wealth, the manifesto where he declared that the rich are merely trustees of fortune, obligated to redistribute it for the public good. Some argue whether this was noble conviction or a clever way to control the narrative of his immense fortune. After all, giving away libraries painted him as a cultural hero, while his workers were still battling 12-hour shifts for pennies. Was it morality, or PR with marble staircases? Still, the power of his gift is undeniable. You picture immigrant families stepping into polished reading rooms, their children leafing through encyclopedias, their futures suddenly stretching beyond the factory floor. Carnegie wasn't handing out fish, he was building oceans. Knowledge became his chosen form of immortality, yet you also catch glimpses of contradiction. For someone who adored knowledge, Carnegie could be oddly insecure about intellectuals. He envied men of letters, craving their respect, but often overcompensated with his checkbook. He courted famous writers and philosophers, sometimes smothering them with flattery, sometimes alienating them with his overbearing eagerness. It's like watching the world's richest hone try way too hard to join the cool kids' book club. And here's a sly aside. While Carnegie was preaching libraries, he was also building a castle in Scotland, where he staged elaborate dinner parties. Nothing says man of the people like sipping brandy under painted ceilings while telling guests how noble it is to give money away. Still, you can't shake the impact of his vision. Carnegie's steel may have built America's skyline, but his libraries built America's imagination. Without them, countless minds might have stayed locked in poverty's cage. With them, possibilities multiplied. And so, as you trace his footsteps from steel mills to stacks of books, you realize Carnegie's legacy isn't simply about choosing knowledge over riches, it's about the tension of trying to straddle both worlds. Some argue whether he truly succeeded, but either way, he left behind the idea that the richest wealth isn't in vaults, but on shelves waiting to be opened. You turn a corner in Carnegie's story and collide with the paradox that defined him. The ruthless bargainer who could smile sweetly while cutting you to pieces in negotiations. His empire wasn't built on steel alone. It was built on sharp deals, relentless pressure, and an uncanny ability to look like your friend even as he wrung every last cent from you. Carnegie believed in efficiency with an almost religious zeal. You see him in boardrooms insisting that every contract, every rail of steel, every worker's shift squeeze out maximum profit. He didn't shout, he charmed. That was his weapon. While some tycoons crushed rivals with sheer force, Carnegie disarmed them with a velvet glove. You'd almost thank him for outmaneuvering you, until you realized your company had just been swallowed whole. Here's the well-known fact. In 1901, Carnegie sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan for a staggering $4 million, the largest industrial transaction of its time. Adjusted for today, that's a sum so enormous it would make even the modern billionaires blink. With one signature, Carnegie went from industrial titan to one of the richest men on earth. But the quirky tidbit, Carnegie once handed Morgan a note scribbled with his asking price, $480 million, and said, almost coyly, that Morgan could have the whole company if he agreed. Morgan barely blinked and accepted. No shouting, no haggling, just a gentleman's deal sealed by mutual confidence. It was the calmest billion-dollar poker hand in history, yet behind these gentle gestures lay a ruthless streak. You uncover his role in labour battles, especially the infamous Homestead Strike of 1892. While Carnegie vacationed in Scotland, his partner Henry Clay Frick crushed the strike with armed guards, leading to bloodshed and deaths. Carnegie claimed distance, but critics argued he couldn't wash his hands so easily. Some argue whether he was truly horrified by the violence or merely horrified at how it tarnished his image. The irony is striking. The man funding peace conferences abroad was at the helm of one of the bloodiest labour disputes at home. It's like discovering your yoga instructor moonlights as a nightclub bouncer. Something just doesn't add up. Still, Carnegie had a knack for spinning stories in his favour. He'd write essays about harmony between capital and labour, often painting himself as the benevolent overseer. Yet workers in his mills lived on razor-thin wages, their lives spent in dangerous conditions. His words and his bargains rarely matched. And here's a clever aside. Carnegie once bragged that he could always hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. It's a chilling quip, but also a testament to his cold understanding of division as a tool of control. Imagine putting that on a motivational poster, probably not a bestseller. What fascinates you isn't just the brutality, but the seamless way he cloaked it. Carnegie could sit in a plush chair, penning letters about the future of humanity, while knowing his profits came from men sweating in infernos of molten steel. He wasn't oblivious, he was compartmentalizing, juggling his dual selves. This duality is why his story hooks you. Some argue whether he should be remembered as the ruthless exploiter or the gentle philanthropist. But as you watch him making billion-dollar deals with a smile, you realize he was both at once, a master of ruthless bargains who also wanted to be remembered for gentle words. You shift the spotlight from steel furnaces to oil fields, and suddenly the world smells of kerosene, smoke, and money. Enter John D. Rockefeller, the man whose grip on oil was so tight that competitors gasped for air. If Carnegie was steel's prophet, Rockefeller was oil's emperor, ruling with a mix of divine calm and ruthless calculation. Imagine Cleveland in the 1860s, oil refineries sprouting like mushrooms after rain. Everyone scrambling for barrels, chasing fortunes with shaky hands. You see Rockefeller calm, deliberate, almost monk-like, studying the chaos. He wasn't chasing oil fever, he was building order out of it. His vision wasn't to drill but to refine, to turn crude into the kerosene that lit lamps across America. That clarity made him lethal. Here's the well-known fact. By the 1880s, Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled about 90% of US refineries and pipelines. That's not market share, that's monarchy. Competing against him was like bringing a slingshot to a cannon fight. His strategy? Undercut rivals, buy them out, or simply make deals with railroads so sweet that competitors couldn't survive. But here's the quirky tidbit. Rockefeller kept a ledger of every penny he earned and spent, starting as a teenager. He once bragged that he could account for every dime of his fortune from day one. Picture the richest man alive, still obsessed with balancing his checkbook. It's both endearing and terrifying. If only your roommate had the same habit before forgetting rent money. Rockefeller's grip wasn't just financial, it was psychological. You watch as rivals collapsed. Not just from his discounts, but from the dread of fighting him. His calm demeanour was unnerving. He never raised his voice, never looked rattled. Some argue whether his greatest weapon was his business model, or his ability to make competitors feel like resistance was pointless. And yet controversy trailed him like oil slick on water. Critics accused him of crushing small businesses, manipulating markets and bending politics. The government eventually broke up Standard Oil in 1911 under antitrust laws. But here's the twist. You realize Rockefeller came out richer. His empire split into companies like Exxon, Chevron, and Mobil, and his stock in each made him even wealthier. It's the ultimate break me if you can move. Still, Rockefeller wasn't all shadow. He tithed religiously from his first paycheck, donating a portion to charity before he had real money. Later, his philanthropy reshaped medicine, education, and science. He funded universities, backed research that wiped out diseases, and built foundations that still shape public health today, who argue whether his giving was penance for monopolistic sins or genuine faith-driven generosity. But either way, you can't walk through modern institutions without brushing against his fingerprints. And here's a sly aside. Rockefeller was famously bald and wore simple suits, looking more like a humble preacher than the richest man alive. Imagine bumping into him at church and having no idea he controlled the oil under your feet. Talk about stealth wealth. As you trace his story, you feel the tension between shadow and light. Rockefeller's grip on oil reshaped America's economy, politics, and even its daily life. He illuminated homes, yes, but he also cast long dark shadows over competition and fairness. His legacy forces you to ask, was he a villain monopolist, a saintly philanthropist, or both at once? You peer closer at Rockefeller and realize that beneath the steel-calm businessman was a man shaped as much by Sunday sermons as by secret railroad contracts. His public image glowed with piety. Faithful churchgoer, Sunday school teacher, a man who refused to work on the Sabbath. But behind the hymns and bow ties, you uncover a mastermind who struck deals so cunning they could make a poker shark blush. Rockefeller's life was anchored in discipline. You see him rising at dawn, praying before meals, and teaching children Bible verses with the same seriousness he applied to balance sheets. He believed that wealth was a trust from God, something to be stewarded with purpose. That belief gave him a calm moral compass, or at least the appearance of one. Some argue whether his faith was genuine conviction or a convenient cloak for ruthless practices, but either way, it gave him a sense of destiny. Here's the well-known fact. Rockefeller's Standard Oil wasn't just a company, it was a machine that perfected the trust model, a way of consolidating dozens of refineries under one umbrella. This structure made it nearly impossible for competitors to fight back. To many, he looked like a humble Christian titan. To rivals, he was the oil octopus, his tentacles wrapping around every pipe and barrel. And now for the quirky tidbit. Rockefeller loved giving out shiny dimes. He'd press them into the hands of children, strangers, even adults he met on the street. At first glance, it seemed whimsical generosity, but it was also a parable of sorts, a reminder that even the smallest coin mattered, and that thrift and savings could build empires. Imagine Elon Musk randomly passing out Tesla keychains and saying, "Build your own car company, kid." It was Rockefeller's eccentric brand of motivational speaking. Behind this pious exterior, though, you see the shadows. Rockefeller struck secret rebate deals with railroads, ensuring Standard Oil shipped cheaper than anyone else. Competitors paid full price. He paid a fraction. It was the invisible hand squeezing the life out of the market. Publicly, he could claim efficiency and faith. Privately, his ledger told a different story. The duality fascinates you. Here was a man who prayed with workers in the morning, then orchestrated moves that would bankrupt them by night. Some argue whether this made him a hypocrite or simply a man compartmentalizing faith and business like two separate worlds. And here's a sly aside. Rockefeller's critics once called him Wreckerfeller, accusing him of reckless greed, but he remained unflappable. He'd respond with that serene, almost smug smile, the look of someone who knew his bank balance was louder than any insult. The more you explore, the clearer it becomes. Rockefeller wasn't driven by oil alone. He was driven by a belief that God had chosen him to manage wealth, and that his methods, no matter how sharp, were justified by the results. To his admirers, he was a model of Protestant discipline. To his enemies, he was a wolf in Sunday clothes. And so, as you watch him walk from Sunday school classes to backroom railroad meetings, you see the contradiction of power wrapped in faith. Was Rockefeller the devout steward of fortune or the master of secret deals? Probably both, and that tension is what cements his legend. Now you leave oil's slick empire and step onto the rumbling tracks of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man who turned railroads into rivers of gold. If Carnegie was the boy who dreamed of steel and Rockefeller the preacher of oil, Vanderbilt was the raw force of transportation, carving paths across America with locomotives that thundered like iron horses. You first meet him as a scrappy teenager ferrying passengers in a small boat around New York Harbor. Nicknamed Commodore, he hustled on water long before he ruled on land. Picture him shouting over waves, collecting fares, and cutting deals even as a kid. That nickname stuck for life, and you can almost see him smirking at rivals, daring them to keep up with his speed and audacity. Here's the well-known fact: Vanderbilt consolidated a patchwork of chaotic railroads into one powerful network, creating lines like the New York Central that connected cities and reshaped commerce. He didn't just own trains, he owned the very arteries of the nation. Suddenly goods, people, and money flowed at his command. Competing against him was like trying to paddle a canoe against a freight train. And here's the quirky tidbit. Vanderbilt was nearly illiterate for most of his life. He could sign his name and track numbers. But fancy letters and essays, forget it. While his peers scribbled contracts in elegant handwriting, Vanderbilt relied on blunt words and instinct. Imagine one of the richest men in America struggling with spelling but effortlessly cornering an entire industry. Proof perhaps that spelling bees don't decide fortunes. Vanderbilt's strategy was ruthless efficiency. You watch him slash fares so low that competitors bled cash until they sold out to him. He'd then jack prices back up once he had control. Some argue whether he was a genius innovator who streamlined transport or a predator who crushed competition just because he could. Either way, he left a trail of bankrupt rivals and consolidated lines that stretched like veins across the East. And yet, for all his railroads, Vanderbilt wasn't a polished gentleman like Morgan or Carnegie. He was brash, direct, and sometimes shockingly crude. He swore, he gambled, and he wasn't shy about bullying politicians. He was in many ways the street fighter of tycoons, dragging refinement behind him like excess luggage. Here's a clever aside. When asked for advice late in life, Vanderbilt reportedly snapped, "Keep the money." Not exactly the kind of wisdom you'd print on inspirational mugs, but undeniably honest. You sense the contradictions again. Vanderbilt built connections, literally knitting the country together, yet he thrived on division, exploiting weaknesses in rivals and politics alike. His fortune ballooned, but so did resentment. Strikes, protests, and accusations of monopoly followed his name like smoke from a locomotive stack. Still, you can't deny the scale of his impact. When he died in 1807, he was worth around $100 million, the largest fortune in America at the time. His wealth was steel tracks and roaring engines, but his legacy was also the blueprint of modern corporate dominance. And so, as you ride alongside his trains, feeling the ground shake beneath wheels of progress, you realize Vanderbilt wasn't just building railroads, he was building a new America, where speed, scale, and sheer willpower ruled the day. Some argue whether he was a hero of efficiency or a tyrant of transportation, but either way, he left the nation forever changed. You linger with Vanderbilt a little longer because behind the roar of his trains was a man full of quirks, tempers, and contradictions. He wasn't just the Commodore, the titan of transportation. He was also a husband who bickered, a gambler who couldn't resist risk, and a personality so blunt it often shocked polite society. One of Vanderbilt's strangest quirks? He was obsessed with horses. Even as railroads made him unimaginably rich, he still poured time and money into breeding racehorses. You picture him, the railroad king, standing in muddy stables, fussing over bloodlines and betting on races. It's almost comical, like Jeff Bezos spending weekends polishing model rockets in his garage while running Amazon. But for Vanderbilt, horses weren't a hobby. They were a passion, and in some ways a throwback to the transport empire he left behind on the water. Here's the well-known fact. Vanderbilt's fortune made him one of the most powerful men in America, but he was famously tight-fisted when it came to philanthropy. Unlike Carnegie or Rockefeller, he didn't sprinkle libraries or foundations across the map. His single major donation? $1 million to found Vanderbilt University in Nashville. Beyond that, he was far more likely to hoard his cash than hand it out. Now for the quirky tidbit. Vanderbilt had a volcanic temper and wasn't afraid to show it. He once told a rival, "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you." Imagine hearing that across the table with Vanderbilt's eyes burning like coal furnaces. You'd probably sign over your company before dessert. It wasn't empty talk either. He often followed through. Still, beneath the gruff exterior, there were odd flashes of sentimentality. When his first wife Sophia died, he was visibly shaken, a rare crack in the armour of a man who usually looked bulletproof. Some argue whether this proved there was a tender side to him, or whether grief just temporarily disarmed his legendary iron will. And here's a clever aside. Vanderbilt was notorious for giving guests at his dinner parties only the barest of food and drink. Extravagant spreads? Not his style. He was too frugal, or maybe too stubborn. Imagine being invited to dine with one of the richest men in the country and leaving hungry. Talk about the original BYO snack experience. The contradictions keep piling up. Vanderbilt was crude but brilliant, tight-fisted but capable of a massive educational gift, brutal in business, yet unexpectedly soft in personal moments. He was the prototype of the American tycoon, unapologetic, unpredictable, unforgettable. As you watch him storm through life, alternately cursing rivals and caressing racehorses, you realise his quirks weren't just side notes, they were central to his legend. Some argue whether his eccentricities made him more human or simply more dangerous, but either way, they stitched together the larger-than-life portrait of the man called the Commodore. You leave the clang of railroads behind and step into a sweeter empire, the world of Mars, where chocolate bars and candy-coated treats built one of the most secretive dynasties in America. If Vanderbilt's trains shook the ground, the Mars family's candy empire melted quietly into pockets and purses, conquering the world with sugar instead of steel. It starts with Franklin Clarence Mars, a man who grew up sickly and stuck at home, where he learned candy making from his mother. You picture him stirring batches of caramel on a kitchen stove, unaware that he was cooking up the foundation of a global dynasty. Out of those small pans came Milky Way, Snickers, and M&Ms, the comfort foods of millions. Here's the well-known fact. Mars Incorporated is one of the largest privately held companies in the world, raking in tens of billions annually while staying out of the stock market. Unlike other dynasties that flaunt their wealth, the Mars family keeps things low-key. No splashy interviews, no Wall Street bell ringing, just candy, pet food, and a fortress of privacy. Now for the quirky tidbit. Forrest Mars Sr., Franklin's son, was famously volatile. He once stormed through factories shouting at employees, demanding perfection down to the milligram of sugar. His motto? If you make a mistake, you're gone. Some employees called him a genius, others called him a tyrant. Imagine your boss yelling about a crooked M on an M&M. Forrest actually did that. Privacy became a family obsession. Unlike Rockefellers or Waltons, the Mars clan avoids public attention like vampires shunning sunlight. They rarely give interviews, live quietly in sprawling estates, and keep their fortunes so shrouded that Forbes has to estimate their net worth. Some argue whether this secrecy is strategic brilliance, shielding the family from scrutiny, or just eccentric paranoia. And here's a sly aside. Despite being candy royalty, the Mars family has a reputation for not exactly being sweet. Employees describe their corporate culture as intense, demanding, sometimes downright bitter. Talk about ironic branding. The friendliest candy in the store might have been born in the crankiest boardroom. Still, their impact is undeniable. From soldiers munching on M&Ms during World War II, the candy was invented to withstand combat heat, to kids trading Snickers on playgrounds, the Mars family quietly embedded themselves into global culture. Their empire isn't flashy skyscrapers, it's Halloween bags, vending machines, and lunchbox staples. You realize this dynasty's power comes not from shouting but from within. They don't dominate headlines with speeches or scandals. They dominate by being everywhere in every checkout aisle without ever stepping into the spotlight. Some argue whether this makes them the smartest dynasty of all. After all, what you don't reveal can never be used against you. So, as you unwrap the story of Mars, you taste both sweetness and secrecy. Their candy kingdom may seem playful, but behind it is a dynasty as tough, disciplined, and mysterious as any oil baron or steel tycoon. You move from chocolate bars to shopping carts, stepping into the world of Sam Walton and the dynasty that turned small-town charm into global retail dominance. The Waltons don't deal in oil or steel. Their empire is built on low prices, wide aisles, and a philosophy so simple it almost feels laughable. Stack it high, sell it cheap, repeat. Yet this unassuming formula reshaped not just shopping, but entire economies. Picture Sam Walton in 1962, driving a beat-up pickup truck into Rogers, Arkansas, where he opened the first Walmart. No fanfare, no towering headquarters, just a store with discounted goods and a dream of scale. He wore khakis, drove himself, and looked more like a neighbor than a mogul. But behind the everyman image was a laser-focused strategist who understood America's appetite for bargains. Here's the well-known fact. Walmart grew into the largest retailer in the world, with thousands of stores worldwide and annual revenues topping hundreds of billions. The Walton family became the richest dynasty in America, their collective wealth eclipsing even the legendary tycoons of the past. Now for the quirky tidbit. Despite his fortune, Sam Walton kept a notoriously frugal lifestyle. He drove a plain pickup truck until the end of his life, wore cheap clothes, and even did his own hunting for bargains. He once said, "Why do I drive a pickup truck? What am I supposed to haul my dogs around in, a Rolls Royce? Imagine Jeff Bezos doing grocery runs in a 1990s Toyota Corolla. That was Walton's brand of billionaire chic. But Walmart's story wasn't just about frugality. You uncover the ruthless side. The company crushed small businesses, squeezed suppliers, and reshaped towns across America. Some argue whether Walmart was a savior of consumers, offering affordable goods, or a destroyer of local economies, gutting mum-and-pop shops. The truth lies somewhere in the tension. And here's a clever aside. Walmart became so massive that in some rural towns, the phrase going to Walmart became shorthand for going shopping. Imagine a store so dominant it basically replaces the word mall or market. That's not just retail, it's cultural colonization. The dynasty behind it all is equally fascinating. Unlike the secretive Mars family, the Waltons are publicly visible through foundations, philanthropy, and sometimes controversy. They fund education initiatives and community programs, but they've also faced criticism for labor practices and low wages. Some argue whether the giving balances out the criticisms, or if it's just a glossy layer on a very aggressive business model. Still, you can't ignore the revolution. Walmart didn't just sell goods. It rewired supply chains, pushed logistics into new territory, and even set the stage for modern e-commerce giants. Without Walton's relentless pursuit of efficiency, companies like Amazon might never have had a blueprint to follow. So as you walk through the fluorescent glow of a Walmart aisle, you realize you're standing inside one of the most powerful dynasties in history. Built not with glitzy skyscrapers, but with pallets, scanners, and low-price guarantees, the Walton Empire shows that sometimes the quietest revolutions are the most disruptive. You step now into the world of the Koch brothers, where oil pipelines twist into political pipelines and fortunes flow as easily into think tanks as into refineries. If Rockefeller was the original oil baron, Charles and David Koch were his late 20th century heirs, tycoons whose reach stretched beyond commerce into the very machinery of government. It began with their father, Fred Koch, who made his early fortune by designing oil refining processes, even doing business with Stalin's Soviet Union before turning fiercely anti-communist. You picture the young Koch brothers growing up in Wichita, Kansas, in a household where capitalism wasn't just a business philosophy, it was a moral crusade. Here's the well-known fact. Koch Industries is one of the largest privately held companies in the US, spanning oil, chemicals, paper products, and more. With revenues in the hundreds of billions, it's an empire that rivals even the largest public corporations, yet it operates largely outside Wall Street's spotlight. And now for the quirky tidbit. Charles Koch reportedly begins his day with a rigorous routine of reading dense economics and philosophy texts. His favourite? Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. Imagine waking up to The Road to Serfdom instead of scrolling through memes. Charles did that daily. It wasn't just business, it was ideology fueling every decision. The Kochs didn't just accumulate wealth, they weaponized it. You watch them channel millions into political action committees, think tanks and advocacy groups shaping debates on taxation, deregulation and climate policy. Some argue whether their influence safeguarded free markets or simply entrenched their own fortune. Either way, their fingerprints appear on countless policy shifts, but the dynasty wasn't without drama. You uncover feuds with their brothers, Bill and Frederick, over inheritance and control, lawsuits dragged on for decades, turning family gatherings into courtroom battles. Imagine Thanksgiving with subpoenas instead of pumpkin pie. And here's a sly aside. The Koch brothers became such a political force that in some circles, their name was shorthand for shadow government. Conspiracy theories painted them as puppet masters pulling strings from behind velvet curtains. The truth? Their influence was massive but far less cinematic. Think boardrooms and fundraisers, not smoke-filled lairs. What fascinates you is their dual legacy. To admirers, they were visionaries protecting individual liberty against government overreach. To critics, they were oligarchs buying democracy wholesale. Some argue whether their philanthropy, funding universities, medical research, and arts programs, redeems their hardball politics or merely softens the edges. As you follow the Koch trail from Wichita to Washington, you realize their power or horseplay wasn't just about money. It was about shaping ideas, rewriting the very rules of capitalism. Their empire shows you that in modern America, the tycoon's grip extends not only to markets but to the minds of citizens themselves. You shift from the smokestacks and pipelines of old empires into glowing screens and silicon chips, where fortunes now rise not from oil wells but from code. If Rockefeller controlled fuel for industry, today's tycoons, Bezos, Musk, Gates, control the fuel of modern life, data, connectivity and technology that has rewired the way you live, work and dream. You picture Bill Gates in a cluttered Albuquerque office in the 70s, tinkering with basic software. He wasn't a rugged steel baron or a frugal shopkeeper, but a bespectacled kid who realized that the world's next empire would be built inside computers. Microsoft became the operating system for the planet, and Gates became the world's richest man. Here's the well-known fact. Gates and Microsoft revolutionized personal computing, making software the foundation of the modern digital age. His fortune catapulted him into the upper echelons of wealth and eventually into philanthropy, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation tackling global health and education. Now for the quirky tidbit. Gates has a notorious Think Week, where he retreats to a cabin with nothing but stacks of books, research papers and diet soda. He reads obsessively, scribbles notes, and emerges with ideas that guide his empire. Imagine your boss saying, "I'll be off grid for a week, alone with a pile of malaria reports. Don't call me unless Windows crashes." That's Pete Gates. Then you jump to Jeff Bezos, who started with a tiny online bookstore in his garage. Amazon grew into the everything store, swallowing retail, cloud computing, and even Hollywood. Some argue whether Bezos is a genius disruptor or a monopolist squeezing competition. Either way, his empire reaches into your mailbox, your streaming queue, and the servers that run half the internet. And then there's Elon Musk, who doesn't just want to dominate markets, he wants to colonize Mars. From Tesla's electric revolution to SpaceX rockets, he blends science fiction with capitalism, turning himself into both tycoon and meme. Quirky tidbit, Musk once sold flamethrowers under his boring company label because apparently cars and rockets weren't entertaining enough. Here's a sly aside. These modern titans tweet more than they talk to journalists. Rockefeller gave speeches, Musk tweets about Dogecoin at 2 a.m. It's empire building in 280 characters or less. But beneath the quirks lies continuity. The same ambition that drove Carnegie and Rockefeller drives Gates, Bezos, Musk and others today. Some argue whether tech barons are the new industrialists repeating history in digital clothes, or whether they've truly built a new kind of empire. As you scroll through their stories, you realize something striking. Yesterday's tycoons carved mountains and bent rivers. Today's titans bend algorithms and launch satellites. The tools change, but the hunger, the restless drive to dominate remains the same. You've admired the skyscrapers, tasted the candy, and marveled at rockets, but now you peek into the darker corners of empire, scandals, betrayals, and shadows where dynasties reveal their cracks. For every glowing success, there's a hushed-up deal, a courtroom drama, or a headline that won't go away. Tycoons may polish their legacies, but you know power always leaves fingerprints. Take the Rockefellers. While John D. built hospitals and universities, his Standard Oil empire faced accusations of monopoly abuse so intense that the Supreme Court broke it apart in 1911. Some argue whether Rockefeller's philanthropy was genuine redemption or just a public relations shield. After all, it's easier to be generous once you've crushed your rivals. Then there's Carnegie, who preached peace and philanthropy but oversaw violent labour disputes like the Homestead strike. Workers bled while his steel profits soared. Was he a benevolent giver or a ruthless exploiter? The debate never really ends. Fast forward to modern dynasties and the shadows grow sharper. The Walton family's Walmart empire has faced lawsuits over labour conditions, low wages and union busting. Some argue whether the Walton billions could be better spent improving employee lives rather than funding elite philanthropy. Imagine clocking out of a minimum wage shift at Walmart only to see the Walton name on a billion-dollar art museum. It's a sharp contrast. The Koch brothers too faced heat. Their vast influence over politics drew accusations of undermining democracy. Critics accused them of funding climate denial campaigns while their industries profited from fossil fuels. Admirers say they were defending free markets. Detractors call it buying policy. Even the candy-coated Mars dynasty couldn't avoid shadows. Reports of intense workplace culture and questionable supply chain practices raised eyebrows. Sweet branding, bitter reality. It's almost poetic. And here's a quirky tidbit. During the 80s, the Koch family feud became so wild that brother Bill literally funded a wine yacht battle against Charles and David. Yes, billionaires suing each other over vineyards while shaping national politics. It was as surreal as it sounds. Some scandals fade with time, others stick forever. You see how each dynasty wrestles with its legacy: philanthropy versus exploitation, innovation versus monopoly, secrecy versus transparency. The truth, you realize, is rarely clean-cut. These stories are messy because power is messy. Here's a sly aside. If tycoons wrote their own obituaries, they'd sound like saints. Luckily, history has a sharper pen. And so, as you sift through the scandals and shadows, you recognize that these empires are human at their core, built by ambition, yes, but also by flaws, mistakes, and sometimes outright deception. That duality is what makes them endlessly fascinating. You now step into the drawing rooms and boardrooms where heirs inherit not just fortunes, but entire legacies. Tycoons may build the empires, but dynasties survive or collapse on the shoulders of the next generation. Passing the torch is never simple. Wealth magnifies ambition, jealousy, and expectation. Think of the Vanderbilts. Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt amassed one of the greatest fortunes of the 19th century, but within a few generations, the money scattered. By the 1970s, Gloria Vanderbilt was famous not for railroads, but for fashion jeans. Some argue whether the Vanderbilts represent the classic shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations curse. Contrast that with the Rockefellers, whose descendants carefully preserved both wealth and reputation. Today, the family is synonymous with philanthropy, art, and finance. They shifted from oil to influence, ensuring the Rockefeller name remained synonymous with legacy, not decline. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sam Walton's heirs, despite being among the richest people alive, are known for squabbles over art collections and private jets. One Walton reportedly flew their horse across the country in a private plane, because apparently first class for ponies is a thing. Generational shifts bring new challenges. The Koch empire saw bitter battles between brothers over control, while the Mars dynasty kept an iron grip on secrecy to prevent leaks. Some argue whether keeping everything in the family preserves stability, or just breeds resentment behind mansion gates. And then there's the tech world. Bill Gates' children won't inherit the bulk of his fortune. He plans to give most of it away. Musk and Bezos, meanwhile, remain question marks. Will their kids become the next tech aristocracy or simply footnotes in Silicon Valley lore? Here's a sly aside. Sometimes it's harder to inherit a fortune than to make one. At least the original tycoons had the thrill of the chase. Heirs. They get the trust fund paperwork and the weight of expectations. You realize these generational handoffs aren't just family dramas, they're stress tests for capitalism itself. Do dynasties endure because of strategy, discipline, and adaptation? Or do they crumble under the gravity of their own excess? The answers lie not only in history books, but in the choices of heirs still living, still steering vast fortunes toward uncertain futures. You've seen dynasties rise in America, but now you widen your gaze and realize wealth empires know no borders. From London to Hong Kong, Sao Paulo to Riyadh, the story of tycoons and dynasties unfolds on a global stage where fortunes cross oceans and cultures, rewriting the rules of power. Think of Li Ka-shing, the Superman of Hong Kong. He built an empire from plastics to ports to telecommunications, becoming one of Asia's richest men. Known for his frugality, he reportedly wore cheap watches despite billions in the bank. Some argue whether his humble image was genuine modesty or calculated branding in a city obsessed with status. Then there's the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, where oil wealth didn't just create a family fortune, it created a state. The royal family's riches are so vast and intertwined with national power that separating dynasty from country feels impossible. Their reach extends through global oil markets, influencing everything from gas station prices to geopolitical alliances. In Mexico, Carlos Slim built a telecom empire so dominant that at one point his wealth rivaled that of Bill Gates. Quirky tidbit. Slim is a collector of old newspapers and even opened a museum to showcase them. Imagine the richest man in the world geeking out over yellowing headlines. It's oddly charming. And then there's Europe's dynastic wealth. The Rothschilds, long associated with banking, influence, and conspiracy theories. Their name carries centuries of weight, often exaggerated but always intriguing. Some argue whether their enduring mystique proves their continued relevance or simply the persistence of myth. Here's a sly aside. In every country, someone's always whispering about the family behind it all. Turns out it's not just an American obsession, it's human curiosity. Global dynasties remind you that ambition isn't cultural, it's universal. Whether it's sugar barons in Brazil, tech magnates in China, or resource kings in Africa, the pursuit of empire transcends geography. You realize that the tycoon's hunger for control, for legacy, needs no translation. And as you connect the dots, you see a pattern. The American dynasties are part of a much larger mosaic of global ambition. Their legacies don't just shape one nation, they ripple across the world, influencing markets, politics, and even your daily life. Whether you're shopping at Walmart, filling your tank, or scrolling on a smartphone assembled half a world away, you've journeyed through oil fields, candy factories, megastores, and tech labs, and now you pause to gather the threads. What do all these dynasties and tycoons have in common? Ambition, certainly. Wealth beyond imagination, of course. But the deeper lesson you uncover is that legacies are built not just on money, but on the stories people choose to tell and the stories they try to bury. Think back to Rockefeller. His empire of oil made him the richest man of his time, yet he spent his later years funding universities and medical research. Carnegie filled libraries with books, but his name is also tied to bloody labour strikes. The Waltons democratized shopping with Walmart's low prices, but critics say they hollowed out communities. Each story is a coin with two sides, gleaming and tarnished. Here's a quirky tidbit to keep you smiling. Andrew Carnegie once gifted a church organ to a small town, only to be told they'd rather have indoor plumbing. Imagine turning down a Carnegie gift because you just want a toilet. Proof that even the grandest gestures can miss the mark. The truth is, legacies are complicated. Some argue whether tycoons should be remembered for their philanthropy or their ruthless business practices. Others wonder whether dynasties ultimately help society progress, or simply hoard wealth across generations. What you notice is that the answer changes depending on who's telling the story, the tycoon, the critic, or the ordinary worker caught in between. Here's a sly aside. No matter how much power they had, none of them got to script the ending. History always gets the final word. As you close this saga, you realize these dynasties didn't just shape markets, they shaped culture, politics, and even imagination. They turned ambition into monuments, products into memories, and wealth into myths. Their stories remind you that behind every fortune is a gamble, behind every empire is a flaw, and behind every legacy is a question mark. And so, the journey ends, but the echoes of these tycoons still rumble through the present. When you flick on For Light, fill your tank, buy a chocolate bar, or scroll through an app, you're brushing against the fingerprints of empires built long ago. The Rockefellers, Carnegies, Vanderbilts, Waltons, Mars family, Kochs, and modern tech titans didn't just create wealth, they altered the very fabric of society. Their legacies stretch like shadows, some cast in gold, others in smoke. Rockefeller's philanthropy coexists with monopoly, Carnegie's libraries with labour strikes, the Waltons' affordability with economic disruption, Musk's rockets with controversy. These contradictions don't cancel each other out, they define the messy truth of power. You realise that wealth at its core is never just about money. It's about control, influence, and the hunger to leave a mark that outlasts mortality. Some tycoons built museums, others endowed universities, still others tried to colonise space. Each sought immortality in a different form, but none could escape history's judgment. The lesson for you: empires fade, but ambition never does. Dynasties may fracture, fortunes may dwindle, but the drive to dominate, to build, to risk, to reach further remains etched into human nature. And that's why these stories will always fascinate us. They aren't just about the rich, they're about the extremes of what it means to be human. So when you next hear a headline about billionaires battling for supremacy, remember, you've seen this story before. The stage changes, the players change, but the script of ambition endures. End of script. Stay curious.